In today's video, you'll hear the story of Emily, an urban explorer who stepped into a place where silence didn't mean peace, but danger. An abandoned telephone exchange, dead lines, and calls coming from where no one could possibly answer. The heavy steel door groaned, a rusty lament against its decades of silence as Emily forced it inward. A gust of stale, frigid air, thick with the scent of damp concrete, ozone, and forgotten dust, billowed out, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. Her flashlight beam, a hesitant explorer in the absolute darkness, cut through the gloom, revealing a cavernous space choked with the skeletal remains of technology from a bygone era. Rows upon rows of monstrous switchboards, their intricate wiring a labyrinth of copper and plastic, stretched into the abyss, covered in a uniform blanket of gray grime. Each rotary phone, perched like a sentinel on its console, was coated in a sticky film, a testament to the passage of time and the stillness that had claimed this place. Emily, a veteran of forgotten architecture, felt an unusual prickle on her skin, a sensation colder than the ambient air, as if the very atoms of the building held a charge, an echo of past conversations and untold secrets. This wasn't just another abandoned building. It felt like a sarcophagus, preserving something that refused to die. Her bootfalls, usually confident and measured, seemed to hesitate, swallowed by the unnatural quiet that preceded her. The silence here was not empty. It was heavy, pregnant with a latent energy, a whispered tension that clawed at the edges of her perception. She moved deeper, her gaze sweeping across the control panels, the banks of flashing lights now dark, the intricate web of wires that once connected countless lives. The air grew heavier, pressing in on her, and the faint hum intensified, no longer just a vibration but a low, resonant thrum, a sound without source that permeated the very core of the building. It was the sound of a sleeping giant, disturbed. Her hand, gloved against the chill, ran across the smooth, cold surface of a polished bakelite telephone receiver, its weight surprisingly substantial. She lifted it, a relic from a time when voices traveled through physical wires, imagining the countless stories that must have passed through its worn mouthpiece. As her fingers brushed against the rotary dial, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The inexplicable hum seemed to converge, focusing itself directly on the receiver in her hand. A faint, distant ringing, like a ghostly echo, reverberated through the vast space, not from the phone she held, but from somewhere deeper within the exchange, a place her flashlight could not yet reach. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a phantom ring in a place long disconnected, a chilling invitation into the heart of its forgotten purpose. Emily's breath hitched, a thin mist in the cold air, as she felt an unseen presence solidifying around her. Her initial investigative instinct, honed by years of urban exploration, quickly gave way to an unsettling apprehension. The ringing persisted, a monotonous, insistent summons from the darkness. It was a classic haunted phone cliché, yet here, in this massive, desolate vault of wires and memories, it felt terrifyingly real. She followed the sound, her footsteps becoming slower, more deliberate, the gravel crunching under her boots the only interruption to the eerie symphony of the ringing. The beam of her flashlight danced across dusty consoles, revealing more phones, each identical to the one in her hand. The ringing was coming from a specific bank of consoles, an older, more imposing section adorned with intricate brass fittings and a web of fabric-covered wires that seemed to pulsate with a faint, unseen light. She approached the source, her heart now thudding against her ribs, a frantic drum against the building's oppressive stillness. The air around this particular section was perceptibly colder, and a faint acrid smell, like burnt electronics mixed with something organic and decaying, assaulted her nostrils. It was a smell that spoke of sudden catastrophe, of things ending abruptly and violently. The ringing stopped as suddenly as it began, plunging the exchange back into a silence even more profound than before, a silence that felt heavy with anticipation, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for her next move. The abrupt cessation was more unnerving than the sound itself, a predator waiting patiently in the shadows. Emily paused, straining her ears, trying to discern any hint of movement or another sound. Only the distant drip of water, somewhere in the vastness of the building, broke the silence. She slowly extended her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, towards the rotary phone that had been the source of the ring. It sat there, inert, just like the others. There was no visible sign of power, no electrical connection. How could it have rung? Her mind, usually quick to find rational explanations, struggled to process the anomaly. As her fingertips grazed the receiver, a jolt of ice-cold energy shot through her. Not electrical, but something ancient and malevolent. The receiver felt heavier, colder, as if it had absorbed the very essence of the building's forgotten anguish. Slowly, carefully, she lifted it to her ear, expecting nothing but dead air, a confirmation of the building's inert state. Instead, a faint, ragged breath, moist and chilling, filled her ear, followed by a series of low, guttural clicks and a distorted whisper that was almost a human voice, yet utterly alien. It was speaking a sequence of numbers, each digit enunciated with a disturbing, wet clarity that vibrated deep within her skull. These were not random numbers. They formed a pattern, a series of coordinates or a date, though she couldn't immediately place them. The voice, if it could be called that, was not angry or threatening, but filled with an unbearable, suffocating sorrow, a profound despair that felt tangible. It was the sound of someone trapped, screaming into a void. She pulled the receiver away, her hand shaking violently, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead despite the frigid air. The voice continued, a faint echo now, as if it had embedded itself within her own mind. The numbers repeated, insistent, demanding. She looked around the vast, silent hall, her flashlight beam sweeping wildly, as if expecting to catch a glimpse of the source. But there was nothing. Only the rows of silent consoles, the tangles of wires, and the oppressive, cold air. The smell of decay intensified, becoming almost sickeningly sweet, like old flowers on a coffin. The hum that she had felt earlier returned, growing louder, vibrating not just in the building, but within her chest, a low, resonant drone that seemed to mirror the sorrowful whisper in her head. She knew, with chilling certainty, that this was not a trick of the old building, nor a figment of her imagination. This was a direct communication, an attempt to bridge the gap between two worlds, and she had just answered. The phone, still warm from her touch, despite the building's chill, lay heavy in her hand, a conduit to something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting patiently for decades to reconnect. The whispers in her mind grew louder, clearer, no longer just numbers but a fragmented plea, a desperate call from a long-forgotten tragedy, and then the faint, distant click of another receiver being lifted echoed from the deepest, darkest corner of the central office. The distant click, sharp and undeniable, tore through the stifling silence of the exchange, a stark counterpoint to the spectral whispers still resonating in Emily's mind. It wasn't merely an echo of her own actions. It was a response, a chilling confirmation that she was not alone in this vast, decaying monument to communication. Her grip tightened on the receiver, its bakelite cool against her clammy palm as she spun on her heel. her flashlight beam cutting frantic arcs through the gloom. The light fell upon the intricate, skeletal framework of the distant switchboards, dancing across dust motes that seemed to swirl with a malevolent intelligence. She scanned the seemingly endless rows, each phone a potential conduit, each wire a dormant nerve. The whispers in her head intensified, no longer just numbers, but a cacophony of distorted pleas and guttural sounds, a chorus of despair that threatened to overwhelm her senses. It was as if the entire network, dormant for decades, had suddenly reanimated, buzzing with the trapped echoes of past tragedies. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure that pushed against her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. A faint, cloying scent of stale perfume and burnt wood began to permeate the air, a phantom aroma that suggested recent occupancy, a horrifying incongruity in this long-abandoned space. Emily, despite her rising panic, forced herself to move, drawn by the unsettling certainty that the source of the click was somewhere in the deepest recesses of the exchange, beyond the reach of the faint light filtering from the distant entrance. She moved cautiously, her steps deliberate, listening intently for any further sound, any sign that the presence was drawing closer. The oppressive silence that had been so unsettling before now felt almost comforting, a respite from the maddening whispers and the phantom click. But that comfort was short-lived. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration began to thrum beneath her feet, a low tremor that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building, rising steadily, filling the space with a low, resonant drone that resonated in her teeth. It was the hum of something immense, something ancient, finally stirring from its long slumber. The thought of Liam and Sarah, waiting outside, a fragile link to the sane world, flickered through her mind, a desperate anchor against the encroaching madness. She imagined their faces, their worried expressions, and the distant familiar sounds of the world outside this tomb of echoes. That thought, however, only served to highlight her isolation, emphasizing the vast, impenetrable distance between them and the unsettling reality unfolding around her. As she navigated the labyrinthine corridors between the switchboards, the air grew colder, the phantom scent stronger, mingling now with a metallic tang like old blood. Her flashlight beam, usually a steady beacon, began to flicker erratically, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that danced and writhed on the dusty walls, momentarily transforming the static machinery into monstrous, contorted figures. Each flicker was accompanied by a sharp, electronic crackle that seemed to emanate directly from the phone in her hand, as if it were struggling to maintain its connection to a reality that was rapidly fraying. She tried to dismiss it as a dying battery, a logical explanation, but the pattern of the flickering, coinciding with the intensifying whispers, denied such simple reasoning. The numbers from the first call repeated in her mind, faster now, jumbling with new, fragmented words that sounded like pleas, choked gasps, and frantic denials. They were voices of unimaginable suffering, echoing through the temporal static of the abandoned lines, desperate to be heard, to be understood. Emily realized with a jolt of horror that these weren't just residual imprints. They were active, sentient entities, trapped within the circuits, yearning for release, and she had just offered them a way out. She reached a particularly large switchboard, a colossal piece of equipment that dominated the center of the exchange. Its polished brass components, though tarnished by time, still gleamed faintly in the erratic light, reflecting her distorted image like a funhouse mirror. This was clearly the main hub, the central nervous system of this mechanical beast, and here, on a console directly in front of her, sat another rotary phone, its receiver noticeably off the hook, dangling by its coiled cord, swaying ever so slightly in an unseen draft. This was the source of the second click. A faint, almost invisible mist seemed to coil around the receiver, shimmering with a sickly, almost iridescent glow that contrasted sharply with the surrounding gloom. It was a tangible manifestation of the unknown, an ethereal residue left by something that had just made a connection. A deep, resonant groan, like a ship's hull straining under immense pressure, emanated from the very heart of the switchboard. A mechanical death rattle that vibrated through the floor and up into her teeth. It was alive, in some horrifying electric sense, and it was reaching out. Emily's eyes fixated on the dangling receiver, a morbid fascination overriding her instinct to flee. The whispers in her head became clearer, individual voices distinguishable amidst the chorus of despair. One voice, high-pitched and frantic, repeated a single name, Alice. Another, deeper and guttural, muttered about the cold and the deep. These were fragments of human suffering, echoes of the original incident that had silenced this place. She recalled the vague rumors about the exchange, the hushed stories of operators vanishing, of lines going dead mid-conversation, all dismissed as local folklore. Now she was experiencing it firsthand, a direct witness to the spectral residue of those tragedies. The faint perfume scent grew stronger, clinging to the air around the console, and Emily felt a sudden, sharp chill, as if an invisible hand had just passed through her. It wasn't just cold. It was a profound, unnatural chill that seeped into her bones, stealing the warmth from within her. The phone in her hand, the one she had picked up earlier, began to vibrate, a low, buzzing sensation that mirrored the hum of the old central office, but more personal, more invasive. She looked down at the vibrating phone, then back at the dangling receiver on the main console. The distinction between them blurred. Was her phone now part of its network? Was she now a part of its system? The thought sent a fresh wave of dread through her. The air around the dangling receiver seemed to ripple, distorting the light as if something immense and unseen was coalescing around it, drawing energy from the very wires. A cold, damp breath ghosted across her cheek, smelling faintly of stagnant water and old copper. Emily recoiled, stumbling backwards, her foot catching on a loose cable, sending a jolt of alarm through her. She felt vulnerable, exposed, a single living presence in a tomb filled with dead voices and hungry circuits. The whispers from the phone in her hand ceased, replaced by a single, deafening dial tone, long and unbroken, emanating directly from the receiver, yet resonating throughout the entire exchange, filling every corner of the massive room. It was not the familiar, comforting sound of a phone ready to connect. It was a hungry, insistent drone, a call to a destination unknown, a gateway opening in the oppressive silence. The dial tone, a monotonous, relentless shriek, seemed to vibrate in her very core, resonating with the primal fear of being connected to something inherently wrong. Emily clamped the phone away from her ear, but the sound persisted, a phantom echo trapped within her own skull. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm in the suffocating silence. She took a few more shaky steps back, her eyes wide, scanning the cavernous space. The air was now heavy with the smell of old blood, a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. The whispers returned, a chaotic chorus of overlapping voices, each screaming for attention, each demanding to be heard. Alice, the cold, the deep, help me. Don't look. He's here. The cacophony threatened to shatter her sanity, blurring the lines between what was real and what was merely a product of the building's malevolent influence. She realized, with a chilling clarity, that the phone in her hand was no longer just a conduit. It was a magnet, drawing these spectral voices, these trapped energies, directly to her. She wanted to drop it, to sever the connection, but her fingers were locked around the receiver, frozen by a strange, overwhelming paralysis. It was as if the phone itself had become an extension of the exchange, its wires now tangled around her very will. A subtle shift in the shadows caught her eye. At the far end of the central office, where the gloom was thickest, she saw it, a faint, almost translucent silhouette, tall and gaunt, standing perfectly still between two towering banks of switchboards. It was barely there, a distortion in the air, but undeniably present. It wasn't human. The form seemed to absorb the minimal light, becoming a void in the already oppressive darkness. It emanated a profound, unnatural cold that seemed to drain the warmth from the very air, pulling it inward. Emily's blood ran cold. This was the entity, the source of the horror, the thing that had silenced this place decades ago. It was observing her, a silent, predatory presence that had been awakened by her intrusion, drawn by her willingness to listen. The whisper in her mind, the one speaking numbers, intensified, becoming a command, a desperate plea for her to connect, to complete a circuit that had been broken for too long. The creature, if it was a creature, remained unmoving, a silent sentinel of despair. But Emily felt its gaze, a weight on her soul that was colder than any physical touch. Its presence filled the vast space, making every shadow a hiding place, every wire a potential trap. The desperate, fragmented pleas from the phone in her hand seemed to grow louder, more urgent, as if the trapped voices were trying to warn her, or perhaps to guide her to their master. She tore her gaze away from the spectral silhouette, her attention snapping back to the phone in her hand, its dial tone now a low, continuous moan. The numbers that the distorted voice had first spoken flashed in her mind, clear as day. She knew with a horrifying certainty that they were not random. They were coordinates, a location, a specific place connected to the original incident, a place where the tragedy had culminated. It was a dark knowledge, unwanted and terrifying, pushing her toward a truth she might not survive. Her logical mind screamed at her to drop the phone, to run, to forget everything she had heard. But the strange paralysis persisted, her fingers locked around the receiver, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and an inexplicable compulsion to understand. The silhouette at the far end of the room remained, a silent, patient observer, its presence growing stronger, denser, as if feeding on her terror. The faint hum of the exchange was now a roaring vibration within her, a symphony of dread that resonated with every beat of her frantic heart. She could feel the building's ancient secrets stirring, roused by her presence, eager to share their burden. The whisper in her mind, now almost a coherent voice, spoke the coordinates again, clear and precise, urging her onward, deeper into the dark heart of the mystery. And as the words formed fully in her mind, she saw a faint, unsettling glow emanating from the central office, not from any light source, but from the intricate network of wires themselves, pulsing like an arterial system coming back to a grotesque life. The faint, unsettling glow pulsating through the intricate network of wires intensified, transforming the monstrous switchboards into a grotesque, living organism. It was a ghastly spectacle, a macabre mimicry of a nervous system reigniting, pumping an unseen current through the heart of the abandoned exchange. Emily watched, transfixed by the horrifying beauty, as the light rippled, a sickly green, then a faint, pulsing red, casting dancing, distorted shadows across the dust-laden consoles. The hum, which had previously been a distant thrum, now resonated through the floorboards, up her legs, and into her very core, a deep, unsettling vibration that felt as if the building itself were breathing around her. It was no longer just the phone in her hand that buzzed. The entire structure seemed to be alive, a colossal dormant beast awakening. The coordinates that had whispered themselves into her mind felt heavier, more tangible, as if they were physically etched onto her consciousness, pulling her towards an inevitable, terrifying destination. She felt a profound sense of foreboding, a chilling certainty that this place, once a hub of human connection, was now a nexus for something far more sinister, something that had patiently awaited its reactivation. The metallic tang of old blood, mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay, grew sharper, assaulting her senses, forcing a metallic taste onto her tongue. It was a smell that spoke of violence, of something terrible that had transpired within these walls. As the glowing wires pulsed, images began to flicker at the periphery of her vision, ghostly impressions superimposed onto the mundane reality of the abandoned equipment. Brief, distorted glimpses of figures moving frantically, of faces contorted in terror, of hands reaching out through a shimmering haze. They were fleeting, like old, degraded film reels, but undeniably present, spectral residue clinging to the air, desperate to be seen, to be acknowledged. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them again, trying to clear her vision. But the images persisted, faint, yet insistent, like memories not her own, forced upon her. The combined assault of sound, scent, and phantom sight threatened to overwhelm her, pushing her closer to the brink of a sanity frayed by the impossible. The silent, gaunt silhouette at the far end of the hall seemed to grow denser, its form absorbing more light, its presence a cold, unwavering pressure against her back, confirming her chilling suspicion that she was no longer merely observing. She was trapped within its domain. A desperate instinct to understand, to rationalize this horror, spurred her forward. She found herself moving toward the section of the switchboard where the wires glowed brightest, a mesmerizing, malevolent core of light. As she drew nearer, the individual whispers in her head began to separate, forming distinct, fragmented phrases. The children, the tunnel, always calling. A young voice whimpered. Another, deeper and guttural, rasped about. The cold, the silence. They don't know. Emily recognized some of the names that appeared in old news clippings about the 1970s incident, forgotten details resurfacing, dredged from the collective memory of the exchange. This was not just a general haunting. These were the very victims, their last moments forever imprinted on the wires, their despair trapped in a grotesque loop. She knew then that the coordinates weren't just a place. They were linked to the disappearance of Alice and the others, the unsolved mystery that had led to the exchange's sudden closure decades ago. The old Mr. Henderson, the reclusive former employee, had hinted at something similar, a vague, fearful warning about the lines that never went dead, a dismissal she had initially attributed to senility. Now his words took on a terrifying new meaning. She reached the epicenter of the glowing wires, a massive patch panel where countless cables converged, pulsing with an inner light like grotesque veins. The receiver, still in her hand, vibrated with a frantic energy mirroring the pulsing light. It felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight imbued with the suffering of decades. She brought it back to her ear, compelled by an urge she could no longer resist. The whispers were clearer now, no longer a cacophony, but a distorted, overlapping dialogue, a desperate symphony of final moments. One voice, shrill with terror, screamed about the man in the mask. Another, younger, cried for Daddy. The metallic tang in the air grew so intense that Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It was the scent of panic, of desperate struggle, of life abruptly extinguished. The The phantom images intensified, forming coherent, albeit distorted, scenes. Shadowy figures moving through dimly lit corridors, the gleam of metal, the sound of a struggle. She saw a fleeting image of a young girl, her face contorted in fear, reaching out before she was pulled away into the oppressive darkness, a scream dying in her throat. This was the tragedy unfolding before her, a spectral playback driven by the reanimated wires. The air around her was now palpably heavy, thick with a cold, oppressive presence that wrapped around her like a shroud. It was the entity she had glimpsed earlier, no longer just a shadow, but a tangible, suffocating weight that pressed against her, making it difficult to breathe. Its coldness seeped into her skin, chilling her to the bone, a profound, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It was a coldness that spoke of death, of an absence of life, of a profound, ancient despair. She felt its gaze, a burning pressure on her back, even though she dared not turn. It was closer now, its silent observation more potent, more predatory. The phone in her hand continued to vibrate, a continuous drone that merged with the hum of the reanimated wires. The whispers from the receiver were no longer just a plea. They were a frantic warning, a desperate attempt to communicate a crucial detail, a missing piece of the puzzle that Detective Miller had never found. The words were fragmented, broken by static and the cries of the trapped, but a single, terrifying phrase began to emerge, repeated by multiple voices in unison. He used the other line. Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments. The other line. It wasn't about the exchange itself, or just the phones. It was about a hidden connection, a secret channel used by the perpetrator during the original incident, a line that bypassed the main switchboard, a ghost line. This would explain why Detective Miller's investigation had hit a dead end, why the disappearances remained unsolved. The old Mr. Henderson, who had worked here, must have known about it, or at least suspected its existence. The realization was a cold, bitter pill. All these years, the answer had been here, trapped in the static, waiting for someone to listen. The spectral silhouette shifted slightly, a subtle movement that made the air crackle with latent energy. It was observing her realization, acknowledging her understanding, as if it had guided her to this very point, compelling her to solve its ancient riddle. The air thrummed with a renewed intensity, a desperate urgency that vibrated from the very walls, as if the entire building was desperate for her to act, to finally bring closure to the horrors trapped within its circuits. The phone in her hand began to emit a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the speaker, but from the very material of the receiver itself, as if the plastic and metal had absorbed the entity's malevolence. It pulsed in her palm, hot then cold, as if battling an unseen force. The phantom images around her intensified, not just glimpses now, but a full-blown, hallucinatory recreation of the past. She saw the central office not abandoned, but bustling with operators, oblivious to the terror that was about to unfold. She saw Alice, a young girl, playing near one of the switchboards, her innocent laughter echoing faintly through the spectral chaos. Then, a shadow, darker than the deepest night, detached itself from the wall, moving with unnatural speed. It was the silhouette, the same one that stood at the far end of the hall, materializing into a more defined, terrifying form, gaunt, elongated, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It moved with a silent, predatory grace, unnoticed by the spectral operators, but visible to Emily, a silent observer caught in a nightmare from decades past. The whispers in her mind, the fragments of the other line, now formed a chilling instruction, a sequence of switches on a specific unmarked panel. a hidden conduit to the horror. She felt an irresistible pull towards the glowing patch panel, a magnetic force guiding her trembling hand. The air around the silhouette solidified, its form becoming clearer, its movements more deliberate. It was now directly behind the ghostly operators, its presence a cold, tangible dread. Emily's breath hitched. A choked gasp caught in her throat. She knew that to follow the whispers, to activate the other line, would mean stepping deeper into this nightmare, potentially releasing whatever terrible force had caused the original incident. But the compulsion was overwhelming. A desperate need to bring peace to the trapped voices, to break the loop of their suffering. Her fingers, guided by an unseen force, began to trace the pattern on the glowing patch panel, following the whispered instructions. Her mind focused solely on the sequence of switches. The old Mr. Henderson's fear, Detective Miller's unsolved case, it all converged here, in this horrifying moment. She was not just an urban explorer anymore. She was an unwitting participant, a key to unlocking an ancient horror. The silence of the exchange was shattered by a sudden sharp crackle from the phone in her hand, like glass breaking, and then a series of rapid, distorted clicks, as if something on the other line was desperately trying to connect, to answer her call. The silhouette at the far end of the hall remained, a patient observer, but its presence felt almost expectant, as if it awaited her next move, a grotesque audience for the unfolding drama. A jolt, like a surge of raw electricity, coursed through her arm as she completed the sequence. The glowing wires pulsated violently, a sickening surge of light that momentarily blinded her. The phone in her hand went dead, the growl replaced by a profound, echoing silence, far more terrifying than the previous cacophony. The phantom images of the past vanished, replaced by the oppressive, dusty reality of the abandoned exchange. But the entity at the far end of the hall was no longer a translucent silhouette. It was solid, imposing, its form a consuming darkness that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Its head was still tilted, but now she could discern two pinpricks of light, a malevolent, ancient gaze fixed directly on her. The scent of blood intensified, becoming unbearable, almost choking her. It wasn't just old blood. It was fresh, metallic, as if a new wound had just opened in the heart of the exchange. A cold, damp breath ghosted across her face, carrying with it the undeniable stench of death and damp earth. She felt a profound sense of despair, a crushing weight that settled upon her, stealing her will to move, to flee. She had connected the line. She had opened the door, and now something had answered. The single, unlit rotary phone on the console in front of her, the one whose receiver had been off the hook, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to rotate, its black dial clicking with a chilling, deliberate precision, spelling out a single, terrifying word. The slow, deliberate rotation of the black rotary dial was excruciatingly precise, each click a hammer blow against the taut silence that now suffocated the central office. The unlit phone on the main console, lifeless moments before, now pulsed with a cold, malevolent energy, its mechanism grinding out a single, terrifying word. Emily, still frozen, felt the vibrations travel through the floor, up her legs, and into her chest, mirroring the frantic rhythm of her heart. Each click echoed the desperate pleas of the trapped voices in her mind, a morbid counterpoint to the word that slowly materialized in her understanding. The dial spun, then paused, then spun again, forming letter by letter. Alice, the name, whispered moments ago from the receiver in her hand, now manifested through a mechanical act, a chilling confirmation of the spectral child's unending torment. It was not a question, but a declaration, a desperate summoning. and Emily felt a profound, crushing despair wash over her, recognizing the name from the fragmented news reports of the decades-old disappearances. This was the entity's twisted answer, a direct connection to the heart of the original tragedy, pulling her deeper into its frigid embrace. The silhouette at the far end of the hall, now solid and undeniably present, seemed to ripple with satisfaction. Its head remained tilted, but the pinpricks of light, its eyes burned with an ancient predatory intelligence, fixed on Emily. It began to move, a slow, deliberate glide across the dusty floor, its form absorbing the ambient light, creating an unnatural void in its wake. There was no sound of footsteps, no whisper of cloth. It was as if the air itself parted for its advance. The metallic tang of blood thickened, burning her nostrils, accompanied now by the faint cloying sweetness of formaldehyde, a smell of preservation and decay, as if the very past were being embalmed around her. Emily felt a profound chill seep into her bones, not just from the entity's presence, but from the realization that this place, this central office, was not merely haunted. It was a living tomb, its wires the veins of a malevolent intelligence, and she was caught within its grotesque circulatory system. The phone in her hand, the one she had used to activate the other line, felt scorching hot, then instantly ice cold, as if battling for control, a conduit struggling to contain the immense, ancient power that had just been unleashed. The dialing stopped. The word Alice hung in the air, a silent scream. The hum of the exchange intensified, a deep, resonant drone that vibrated through the very core of the building, shaking the dust from the ceilings. The phones on every console along the endless rows began to tremble, a low collective shudder that rippled through the vast space. Then, one by one, with agonizing slowness, their black receivers began to lift themselves off their hooks, swaying gently, as if held by unseen hands. It was a silent, terrifying ballet of reanimated technology, a chorus of dead lines opening simultaneously, all listening, all waiting. Emily felt 1,000 unseen gazes fix on her, the collective despair of all the trapped souls converging, focused by the entity's presence. The phantom images, fleeting before, now solidified into a spectral crowd, translucent figures shimmering between the switchboards, their faces etched with terror and profound sadness. They were the victims, the lost, the echoes of a forgotten time, all gathered, drawn by the new connection she had forged, their silent presence amplifying the suffocating dread. The entity was closer now, its form still indistinct in the oppressive gloom, but its coldness was palpable, stealing the breath from her lungs. It was an overwhelming force, a presence that consumed light and warmth, a void that threatened to swallow her whole. The whispers in her mind, previously fragmented, coalesced into a single, chilling narrative, played out by a multitude of overlapping voices, each a ghost of a voice from the past. It was the story of Alice, a young operator, alone on the night of the incident, inadvertently stumbling upon the other line, a secret connection used by a local serial killer. The voices described her frantic attempts to warn others, her desperate calls for help, ignored or dismissed, until her own line went dead. The central office, designed for connection, had become a tomb of unanswered pleas. The coordinates Emily had received were not of the killer's lair, but of Alice's last, desperate attempt to send a message, a cry for help from a forgotten tunnel beneath the city, connected to the very network she now stood in. This was the true horror. The system itself had absorbed their suffering, transforming into a monstrous repository of their final moments. Emily tried to scream, to break the suffocating silence, but no sound escaped her throat. Her limbs were leaden, her will paralyzed by the overwhelming despair that emanated from the spectral crowd and the dominant presence of the entity. The scent of formaldehyde and blood became nauseatingly strong, stinging her eyes, a testament to the decades of suffering preserved within these walls. The hundreds of dangling receivers around her began to swing, slowly at first, then faster, a macabre pendulum chorus clicking against the consoles, a rhythmic, maddening clatter that echoed Alice's final struggle. Each click was a ghost call, a desperate attempt to communicate, to break free. Emily knew with a horrifying certainty that the entity was not merely observing, it was feeding on the trapped despair, on her terror, on the energy of the reanimated lines. It was the guardian of the suffering, a silent, ancient predator that had been awoken by her attempt to connect, and now it was claiming its due. She saw the spectral figure of Alice, faint and translucent, standing near the unlit phone that had dialed her name. Her eyes, hollow and filled with an ancient sorrow, were fixed on Emily, a silent plea for release. Emily realized the horrific truth. Alice and the others were not trying to escape. They were trying to be heard, to pass on the truth, the coordinates, the warning. But the entity was twisting their message, using their suffering as bait, trapping new victims within its web. Emily was not a rescuer. She was the next connection, another soul to feed its insatiable hunger. The phone in her hand, no longer burning or freezing, simply vibrated with a dull, incessant hum, a low drone that mirrored the mournful cry of the entity, a lament that promised an eternity of silence. It was a call that would never truly end, a connection that could never be severed. She felt the ancient cold presence of the exchange drawing her in, its wires extending, unseen, wrapping around her ankles, her wrists, pulling her closer to the glowing patch panel, to the central hub of its agony. The spectral crowd of victims began to murmur, their fragmented whispers intertwining with the hum of the exchange, creating a deafening wave of despair. "Join us. Listen. Never leave." The words echoed in her mind, a seductive promise of a grotesque connection, a permanent bond to their suffering. The entity glided even closer, its form now a towering, absolute darkness, blotting out the faint light from the distant entrance. Its gaze burned into her, not with anger, but with an ancient, bottomless hunger. Emily's feet seemed to sink into the dusty concrete, as if the floor itself were becoming viscous, holding her in place. The dangling receivers around her spun wildly, their clicks rising to a frantic crescendo, a desperate warning, or perhaps a mad symphony of welcome. She could feel the chill seeping deeper, bypassing her skin, flowing directly into her veins, slowing her blood, numbing her senses, preparing her for the final connection. Her mind, usually so sharp and logical, began to fray at the edges, assailed by the overwhelming sensory overload and the crushing weight of the trapped despair. The very air around her began to solidify, thickening into a viscous cold gel that pressed against her skin, making every movement an immense effort. Emily gasped, a futile attempt to draw a full breath, but her lungs felt compressed, as if filled with lead. She could see the faint outlines of the spectral victims reaching out to her, their translucent hands seeming to pass through the solid air, desperate to make contact. Their whispered pleas became more insistent, less fragmented, now forming a single, collective command. Dial the number. The other side. It was the number Alice had tried to call, the last desperate message, the one that the entity had intercepted and corrupted. Emily's hand, still clutching the dead receiver, began to lift, as if guided by an unseen force, her fingers compelled to rotate the dial. The rotary phone on the main console, having spelled Alice now stood motionless, its dial a black, silent void, waiting for her to complete the grim equation. The entity loomed directly over her, its form a consuming darkness, its presence so overwhelming that the air thrummed with its malevolent energy. The image of Liam and Sarah, waiting outside, suddenly flashed brightly in her mind, a beacon of reality against the encroaching madness, a surge of desperate resistance, a primal scream of self-preservation ignited within her. She fought against the unseen compulsion, her muscles straining, her body trembling with the effort. Her fingers, which had begun to move towards the dial, now clenched around the receiver. The entity seemed to sense her defiance. The oppressive cold intensified, burrowing into her very marrow, a burning chill that promised to freeze her from the inside out. The humming of the exchange reached an unbearable pitch, a high-pitched whine that scraped against her eardrums, threatening to burst them. The spectral crowd of victims pressed in closer, their whispers becoming a collective moan of anguish, their translucent forms flickering with desperation, as if urging her to succumb, to join them in their eternal torment. The air rippled with raw, unfiltered terror, and the smell of blood was so strong, Emily could taste it, acrid and metallic on her tongue. With a final desperate surge of will, a defiant roar that never escaped her lips, Emily pulled her arm back, tearing the dead receiver from her ear and hurling it into the darkness. The sound of its impact, a distant hollow clang against metal, was swallowed by the overwhelming hum of the exchange. The momentary release was intoxicating, a desperate breath of clarity in the suffocating horror. But it was short-lived. The silence returned, not the previous expectant silence, but a profound, deafening void that seemed to suck all sound, all light, all life from the air. The humming stopped. The spectral crowd vanished. The dangling receivers, still suspended in the air, froze, motionless. The only presence left was the towering, absolute darkness of the entity, standing directly in front of her, its two pinpricks of light, its eyes burning with an ancient, cold fury. It no longer moved. It simply was. The air around it vibrated with an immense, palpable pressure, a silent, all-consuming despair that seemed to press her into the dusty floor. It had achieved its connection. She had completed the circuit, not by dialing but by rejecting the call, an act that had only solidified its grasp. The single, unlit phone on the main console, the one that had dialed Alice, now began to vibrate with a low, continuous ring, emanating directly from its receiver, a sound for no one, echoing eternally in the dead silence of the abandoned central office, a call that would never be answered, for it was no longer calling outward, but inward, into the abyss Emily had unknowingly created. And with that, their story came to an end. But it leaves one last question for you. If the deadline you answered began to ring for you, what would you hear in the endless silence? Share your answer in the comments below. See you in the next one.